When he pushed through the wrong door, little Sarah looked up from her hospital bed and whispered, "Are you my angel?" And Dean Martin's eyes filled with tears, because nobody had ever recognized him like that before. Wait a second, because Dean's choice that night would make him not just an entertainer, but a real healer, and almost nobody understood what it cost him to stay. The Sands Casino's back exit had always confused Dean, especially after 3 hours under those blazing stage lights. The bow tie felt like a noose around his neck, and the tuxedo jacket clung to his shoulders with dried sweat. He'd just finished his second show of the night, That's Amore still echoing in his head, when he pushed through what he thought was the parking garage door. But instead of concrete and Cadillacs, he found himself in a sterile hallway that smelled like disinfectant and fear. The sign on the wall read St. Mary's Children's Hospital, Pediatric Emergency Wing. Dean stopped dead in his tracks, bow tie suddenly feeling even tighter. Through the glass doors ahead, he could see small figures in hospital gowns, some crying, others just staring at nothing with that 1,000-yard stare he recognized from his own childhood. "Oh my God, is that Dean Martin?" The voice came from behind him. A young nurse with tired eyes and coffee stains on her uniform had emerged from a side room. She clutched a clipboard against her chest like armor. "I'm so sorry, sir. You must be looking for the main casino entrance. It's Mr. Angel Man." The little voice cut through the nurse's directions like a bell. Dean turned to see a small girl, maybe 6 years old, pressing her face against the glass door. Her head was wrapped in white bandages, and her hospital gown hung loose on her tiny frame. But her eyes were bright and desperate and full of something Dean hadn't seen directed at him in years. Hope. Listen to what happened next, because this is where the story gets complicated. Dean could have turned around, should have turned around. He had a reputation to protect, after-party obligations, and Sammy Davis Jr. was probably already wondering where he'd disappeared to. But something in that little girl's expression froze him in place. "Sarah, honey, get back to your bed," the nurse called gently. "This man was just leaving, but he's got the sparkly clothes," Sarah said, not moving from the door. "Like the angels in the picture books." The nurse looked at Dean with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Martin. She's been asking for an angel all week." "The brain surgery." "Well, children say things. Brain surgery." The words hit Dean like a punch to the gut. He looked at Sarah's bandaged head again, at the way she held herself against the door like she might collapse any second. Then he noticed the other children behind her. A boy with no hair from chemotherapy, twins sharing a wheelchair, a teenager with crutches who couldn't have been older than 16. Dean Martin had performed for presidents, movie stars, and millionaires, but he'd never performed for an audience like this. "What time do visiting hours end?" he heard himself asking. The nurse blinked. "Well, technically, they ended an hour ago, but..." "Good," Dean said, loosening his bow tie. "Then we won't have any interruptions." He pushed through the glass doors. The pediatric ward erupted in whispers and pointing fingers. Some of the older kids recognized him immediately. They'd seen him on the Ed Sullivan Show or heard "Everybody Loves Somebody" on the radio. But the younger ones just saw a man in a fancy black suit who seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. "Are you really an angel?" Sarah asked, as Dean knelt down beside her bed. Dean's throat felt tight. "Not exactly, sweetheart, but I do know some songs that might make you feel better." Notice something here. Dean didn't call for his manager, didn't ask about liability insurance, didn't worry about the photographers who might show up. He just started humming. The melody was soft at first, almost inaudible. "Everybody loves somebody sometime," but without the big band arrangement, without the casino lights and the champagne and the applause, the song sounded different, smaller, more personal. "Everybody loves somebody sometime," Dean sang quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everybody falls in love somehow." Sarah's eyes widened. The boy with the bald head rolled his wheelchair closer. The twins stopped whispering to each other. Even the teenage girl on crutches limped over to listen. But remember this moment, because what happened next revealed something about Dean Martin that even his closest friends never knew. Something in your kiss just told me, Dean continued, reaching out to gently touch Sarah's bandaged hand. My sometime is now. Sarah giggled, the first time she'd laughed in 3 weeks. According to the chart hanging at the foot of her bed, the sound was like music to Dean's ears, better than any standing ovation he'd ever received. Do you know any funny songs? Asked the boy in the wheelchair. His name tag read Tommy, age 9. Dean grinned, and for the first time all night, it felt real. Tommy, my boy, do I know funny songs? I practically invented funny songs. He launched into Ain't That a Kick in the Head, but he changed the lyrics as he went. Instead of like the fella once said, it became like the doctor once said. Instead of ain't that a hole in a boat, it became ain't that a hole in your sock. The children howled with laughter at every silly substitution. Stop for a second and picture this scene from above, because what you're about to understand changes everything about why Dean stayed so long. The pediatric ward was arranged in a circle, with the nurses' station in the center, and the children's beds radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Dean had positioned himself in the middle, turning slowly as he sang so every child could see his face. But what the children couldn't see, and what Dean was desperately trying to hide, were the medical charts hanging at the foot of each bed. Sarah's chart had a red notation, terminal. Tommy's chart read, leukemia, final stage. The twins shared a chart that simply said, palliative care only. Dean Martin was performing for children who wouldn't live to see Christmas, and he was starting to understand that some of them knew it. Mr. Angel Man, Sarah said during a pause between songs, when I go to heaven, will there be music? The question hung in the air like smoke. Dean felt every parent's worst nightmare, every performer's biggest fear, and every human being's most helpless moment all rolled into one. What do you say to a dying child who thinks you're an angel? Wait, because Dean's answer to that question would haunt him for the rest of his life in the best possible way. Sarah, Dean said, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, there's going to be so much music in heaven that they'll need someone really special to help organize it all. Someone who knows all the best songs. Like you? No, sweetheart. Like you. Sarah's smile could have powered the entire hospital, and in that moment, something shifted in Dean Martin. The performer who'd spent decades entertaining crowds finally understood what entertainment really meant. It wasn't about the applause. It wasn't about the money or the fame or the reviews in Variety. It was about this one small person feeling less alone in a scary world. Will you teach me a song for heaven? Sarah asked. Dean's voice caught in his throat. What kind of song would you like to know? Something happy, something that makes other people feel better when they're sad. Listen to this carefully, because what Dean chose to teach her wasn't what anyone expected. He could have picked one of his famous numbers. That's Amore, or Memories Are Made of This. Instead, he taught her a song his own mother had sung to him when he was sick as a child. A simple Italian lullaby called Stella Stellina. Stella Stellina. Dean sang softly. La notte si avvicina. The star is shining. The night is coming near. La fiamma traballa. The flame is flickering. La moca è nella stalla. The cow is in the barn. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't even particularly melodic, but it was pure and honest, and filled with the kind of love that only exists between a parent and a child, or in this case, between a frightened entertainer and a dying little girl. Sarah repeated the words back to him, her pronunciation clumsy but her intention clear. The other children listened in fascination as Dean taught them the simple melody, their small voices joining together in that sterile hallway. Remember this moment, because it's the exact instant when Dean Martin stopped being just a singer and became something more. Stella Stellina, the children sang together, their voices creating an impromptu choir. The nurses had gathered in the doorway, some wiping tears from their eyes. Dr. Patricia Hensley, the head of pediatric oncology, stood at the back of the group with her arms crossed. She'd worked in this ward for 15 years and had learned to keep her emotional distance from the children. But watching Dean Martin teach a lullaby to kids who might not live to sing it again was breaking her professional composure. "How long can he stay?" she whispered to Nurse Rodriguez. "Technically, visiting hours ended 2 hours ago. But look at them." Dr. Hensley did look. For the first time in weeks, Sarah wasn't crying. Tommy had forgotten about the pain in his joints. The twins were smiling instead of staring at the ceiling. Even Marcus, the 16-year-old who'd been refusing to speak to anyone since his diagnosis, was mouthing along to the words. "He can stay as long as he wants," Dr. Hensley decided. But hold on to that thought, because Dean was about to face a choice that would define the rest of his career. A man in an expensive suit appeared in the hallway behind the medical staff. Dean recognized him immediately. Jerry Weinstein, his manager and the man responsible for every dollar Dean earned. Jerry's expression was thunderous. "Dean," Jerry called out, not bothering to lower his voice. "What the hell are you doing? Sinatra's been waiting for you at the Flamingo for 3 hours. We've got the Paramount executives flying in tomorrow morning, and you're supposed to be schmoozing with Jerry," Dean said quietly, not moving from Sarah's bedside. "Not now." "Not now? Dean, you've got contracts, obligations. This is a multi-million-dollar." "I said not now." The steel in Dean's voice was unmistakable. The children fell silent, sensing the tension. Sarah's small hand found Dean's larger one, and she squeezed it with all the strength she had left. Jerry looked around the pediatric ward, at the bald children, the medical equipment, the charts with their grim prognoses, and for a moment, his expression softened, but only for a moment. "Dean, I understand this is touching, but you can't save these kids by singing to them. You've got a career to think about. Responsibilities." Notice what Dean Martin did next, because it's the single most important decision he ever made on or off any stage. Dean looked down at Sarah, whose eyes were getting heavy from medication, but who was still humming Stella Stellina under her breath. He looked at Tommy, who'd wheeled his chair as close as possible to hear every note. He looked at the twins, the teenager with crutches, and all the other children who'd gathered around him like he was the most important person in the world. Then he looked back at his manager. "Jerry," Dean said calmly, "cancel everything." "Cancel everything?" "Dean, you can't just, I mean everything. The Paramount meeting, the recording session, the photo shoot for Life magazine. Cancel all of it." Jerry's face went white. "Dean, you're not thinking clearly. These contracts have penalty clauses. The studio will sue you for." "Let them sue." The words echoed through the pediatric ward like a gunshot. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The nurses stopped whispering. Even the medical equipment seemed to pause in its constant beeping. "Sarah," Dean said, turning back to the little girl, "would you like to hear another song?" "Yes, please, Mr. Angel Man." And with that, Dean Martin made a choice that would cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars, infuriate some of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and completely change his understanding of what success actually meant. But remember this, because what happened over the next 6 hours was just the beginning. Dean stayed at Sarah's bedside until dawn. He sang every song he could remember, Sinatra numbers, old standards, silly ditties he'd learned as a child, even Happy Birthday for Tommy, whose 9th birthday had passed unnoticed 3 days earlier. When Sarah finally fell asleep around 4 a.m., Dean moved to Tommy's bedside. When Tommy's medication made him drowsy, Dean sat with the twins. When the twins needed rest, he talked quietly with Marcus, the 16-year-old who'd been so angry about his diagnosis that he'd barely spoken to anyone in weeks. "Why are you really here?" Marcus asked, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the hospital windows. It was a fair question. Dean had been asking himself the same thing for hours. I don't know, Dean admitted. I got lost, I guess. Lost. I've been performing for 20 years, Dean said, loosening his bow tie completely. I thought I knew what music was for. I thought it was about making people feel good for a couple of hours, maybe making them forget their troubles while they had a drink and watched the show. Marcus nodded, understanding more than most adults would have. But tonight, Dean paused, looking around at the sleeping children. Tonight I learned that music isn't about making people forget. It's about helping them remember. Remember what? That they're not alone. Look at what was happening here. Because this is the moment when Dean Martin discovered his real calling. The sun was fully up now, and the day shift nurses were arriving. Dr. Hensley had stayed the entire night, partly to monitor her patients, and partly to watch the most unusual therapy session she'd ever witnessed. Dean Martin had somehow managed to give each child exactly what they needed. Laughter for some, comfort for others, and for all of them, the simple knowledge that someone cared enough to stay. Mr. Martin, Dr. Hensley said as the morning shift took over, I need to ask you something. Dean stood up from Marcus's bedside, his tuxedo wrinkled and his hair disheveled. What's that, Doc? Would you consider coming back? The question hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure the other would cross. These children, Dr. Hensley continued, they're going to talk about tonight for whatever time they have left. Sarah hasn't smiled in 3 weeks. Tommy forgot about his pain for 6 straight hours. And Marcus told me this morning that he wants to try eating again. Dean felt something twist in his chest. What are you asking me exactly? I'm asking if you'd be willing to visit regularly, not as Dean Martin the entertainer, but as, well, as whatever you were tonight. Wait, because Dean's answer to this request would reshape not just his career, but his entire understanding of who he was supposed to be. Doc, Dean said slowly, I've got a question for you. Shoot. How many children are in this hospital? The pediatric wing has 46 beds. We're usually at capacity. Dean did quick math in his head. 46 children. Some terminal, some fighting, some hanging on by pure stubbornness and love. 46 kids who went to sleep every night in a sterile room, surrounded by machines and medicine, and the constant fear that tomorrow might not come. I'll be here every Tuesday night, Dean heard himself saying, after my last show, for as long as you'll have me. Dr. Hensley's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Martin, I don't know how to thank. Don't thank me yet, Doc. I'm probably going to be awful at this. But he wasn't awful at it. In fact, Dean Martin's Tuesday night visits to St. Mary's Children's Hospital became legendary among the medical staff, the families, and eventually, the children themselves. He came every Tuesday for the next 8 years, through his divorce, through his struggles with alcohol, through the ups and downs of his career, through Frank Sinatra's retirement and comeback, through the British invasion and the changing face of American entertainment. Every Tuesday night, Dean Martin would finish his last show at whichever casino was currently paying his salary, change out of his performance clothes into jeans and a comfortable shirt, and drive to St. Mary's said. Remember this detail because it shows you something important about who Dean really was underneath all the showbiz glitter. He never brought photographers, never called the press, never used his hospital visits for publicity or tax write-offs or any of the calculated charity work that most entertainers engaged in. The only people who knew about Dean's Tuesday nights were the medical staff, the children, and eventually some of the parents who happened to be visiting late. Sarah lived for 6 more weeks after that first night. Dean was there for her last Tuesday, singing Stella Stellina while she slipped away in her sleep. Her mother, a woman named Patricia Morrison, who'd been staying at the hospital around the clock, found Dean crying in the hallway afterward. She wasn't afraid, Patricia told him through her own tears. She said she was ready to help organize the music in heaven. Tommy lasted 3 months. The twins made it to Christmas, which was 4 months longer than anyone expected. Marcus, the angry 16-year-old, went into remission and eventually became a nurse himself, working in the same pediatric ward where Dean had sung to him. Listen to this carefully, because this is where the story reveals its real meaning. Over 8 years, Dean Martin sang to more than 300 children. Some recovered, some didn't. Some were there for a single Tuesday visit, others became part of his extended family. But every single one of them taught him something about the difference between entertaining people and actually touching their lives. The music industry never understood Dean's Tuesday night commitment. His managers complained about the scheduling conflicts. Other entertainers thought he was crazy to give away his time for free. Even Frank Sinatra, Dean's closest friend, never quite grasped why Dean insisted on spending every Tuesday in a children's hospital instead of out on the town. "What do you get out of it, Dino?" Frank asked him once. "Everything," Dean answered. "I get everything." And he wasn't exaggerating. Those Tuesday nights at St. Mary's changed Dean Martin's entire approach to performance. He started paying more attention to individual faces in his audiences. He began choosing songs based on what people needed to hear, not just what would get the biggest applause. He learned the difference between being a star and being a human being. But notice this, because the most important lesson Dean learned had nothing to do with music at all. It was about showing up, week after week, Tuesday after Tuesday. Whether he was exhausted or hungover or dealing with his own personal crises, Dean showed up. The children could count on him. In a world where their own bodies were betraying them, where medical procedures were scary and unpredictable, where tomorrow was never guaranteed, Dean Martin became the one constant they could rely on. He was there when 8-year-old Michael took his first steps after spinal surgery. He was there when twin sisters Lucy and Linda celebrated their 10th birthday, a milestone their parents had been told they'd never reach. He was there when 17-year-old David got accepted to college, despite having spent most of his junior year in treatment for bone cancer. And he was there for the children who didn't make it. Sarah, Tommy, little Maria, who loved to hear "That's Amore" in her native Italian, dozens of children whose names Dean carried with him for the rest of his life, whose faces he saw in the audience every time he performed anywhere. The Tuesday night visits ended only when Dean's own health began to fail in the early 1980s. By then, St. Mary's had created the Dean Martin Pediatric Music Therapy Program in his honor, bringing professional musicians to the children's ward every week. The program still exists today, though very few people know that it started because a famous singer got lost looking for a parking garage. Hold on to this final image, because it explains everything about who Dean Martin really was when the spotlights went dark. Dean Martin's last Tuesday night at St. Mary's was December 22, 1981. He was 64 years old, fighting his own battles with emphysema and the effects of years of heavy drinking. His voice wasn't what it used to be, and climbing the stairs to the pediatric ward left him short of breath. But he was there. The children that night were different from Sarah and Tommy and all the others from years before. New faces, new names, but the same desperate hope, the same need for someone to care, the same yearning for a little magic in a world that seemed determined to break them. "Are you really Dean Martin?" asked a 9-year-old girl named Amanda, who'd been born long after Dean's biggest hit records, but who'd heard the older nurses talking about the famous singer who visited every Tuesday. Dean smiled, and even though his voice was raspy and his hands trembled slightly, his eyes still held all the warmth that had comforted hundreds of children over 8 years. "No, sweetheart," he said, just like he'd said to Sarah all those years ago. "I'm not really Dean Martin. I'm just someone who knows some songs that might make you feel better." And then he sang Stella Stellina one more time, his voice mixing with Amanda's younger one, creating a bridge between all the children who'd come before and all the children who would come after. The night Dean Martin got lost looking for his car was the night he found his way to everything that really mattered. He discovered that the most important audience isn't the one that applauds the loudest, but the one that needs you most. He learned that the greatest performance isn't the one that makes people forget their troubles, but the one that helps them find the strength to face whatever comes next. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995, almost exactly 14 years after his last Tuesday night at St. Mary. The obituaries focused on his entertainment career, his partnership with Jerry Lewis, his membership in the Rat Pack, and his decades of hit records and movies. But at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, they remembered something different. They remembered a man who got lost one night and found his way to the most important work of his life. They remembered Tuesday nights filled with laughter and music and the kind of magic that can't be bought or sold or captured on any record. And if you want to know what really happened to little Amanda, the last child Dean sang to, let me know in the comments, because her story might surprise you even more than this one did.